reading Signatures of the Visible by Fredric Jameson. Introduction. The visual is essentially pornographic, which is to say that it has its end in rapt, mindless fascination. Thinking about its attributes becomes an adjunct to that if it is unwilling to betray its object, while the most austere films necessarily draw their energy from the attempt to repress their own excess rather than from the more thankless effort to discipline the viewer. The pornographic films are thus only the potentiation of films in general, which ask us to stare at the world as though it were a naked body. On the other hand, we know this today more clearly because our society has begun to offer us the world, now mostly a collection of products of our own making, as just such a body that you can possess visually and collect the images of. Were an ontology of this artificial, person-produced universe still possible, it would have to be an ontology of the visual, of being as the visible first and foremost, with other senses draining off it. All the fights about power and desire have to take place here, between the mastery of the gaze and the illimitable richness of the visual object. It is ironic that the highest stage of civilization thus far has transformed human nature into this single protean sense, which even moralism can surely no longer wish to amputate. This book will argue the proposition that the only way to think the visual, to get a handle on increasing, tendential, all-pervasive visuality as such, is to grasp its historical coming into being. Other kinds of thought have to replace the act of seeing by something else. History alone, however, can mimic the sharpening or dissolution of the gaze. All of which is to say that movies are a physical experience and are remembered as such, stored up in bodily synapses that evade the thinking mind. Baudelaire and Proust showed us how memories are part of the body anyway, much closer to odor or the palate than to the combination of Kant's categories, or perhaps it would be better to say that memories are first and foremost memories of the senses, and that it is the senses that remember and not the quote person end quote or personal identity. This can happen with books if the words are sensory enough, but it always happens with films. If you have seen enough of them and unexpectedly see them again. I can remember nothing but conscious disappointment from a visit to a then current Soviet film at the Excerpt Theater in Boston over 20 years ago. When I saw it again last week, vivid gestures reawakened that have accompanied me all that time without my knowing it. My first thought, how I could ever have forgotten them, is followed by the Proustian conclusion that they had to have been ignored or forgotten to be remembered like this. But the same thing may be observed in real time. In the scene between the day to day, the filmic images of the night before stain the morning and saturate it with half-conscious reminiscence in a way calculated to reawaken moralizing alarm, like the visual of which it is a part, but also in essence and concentration, and an emblem and a whole program. Film is an addiction that leaves its traces in the body itself. This makes it inconceivable that an activity occupying so large a proportion of our lives should be assigned to a specialized discipline, but also that we could ever hope to write about it without self-indulgence. Barthes thought certain kinds of writing, perhaps we should say certain kinds of sentences, to be scriptable, because they made you wish to write further yourself. They stimulated imitation and promised a pleasure in combining language that had little enough to do with the notation of new ideas. But I think that he thought this because he took an attitude towards those sentences which was not essentially linguistic and had little to do with reading. What is scriptable indeed is the visual or the musical, what corresponds to the two outside senses that tug at language between themselves and dispute its peculiarly unphysical attention, its short circuit of the sentences for the mind itself, that makes of the mysterious thing reading some superstitious and adult power, which the lowlier arts imagine uncomprehendingly, as animals might dream of the strangeness of human thinking. We do not in that sense read painting, nor do we hear music with any of the attention reserved for oral recitation. But this is why the more advanced and rationalized activity can also have its dream of the other, and regress to a longing for the more immediately sensory, wishing it could pass altogether over into the visual or be sublimated into the spiritual body of pure sound. Scriptable is not, however, the poetry that actually tries to do that, and which is then itself condemned to the technical mediation of a relationship to language not much more, quote, poetic, end quote, than the doctrine of the coloration of orchestral instruments and the specialized, painfully acquired knowledge of their technologies. It is the prose stimulated by the idea of sound, or the sentences that something visual and unfortunately are only word for this, or unfortunately our only word for it is the image, calls into being by suggestion and by a kind of contamination. We don't write about these things. It is not a metaphorical representation that the sensory pretext summons, but rather something related by affinity that prolongs the content of the object in another, more tenuous form, as though to prolong a last touch with the very fingertips. Out of nature, sound and the image will have to involve differentiation. It is only the single natural tone. The stone you hear through the peculiar dullness of a heavy drop of water, or the quote, green so delicious it hurts, end quote, that has the power to hold the sensory attention for a time and at some length to fascinate. What is humanly produced must come in twos by way of articulated contrast, but of course that way you get two for one. What is, however, pursued by writing in these other senses is somehow subjectivity itself, which seems to have something to do with the coloration of the instruments, and in particular the ways in which their sounds cross and oddly interfere, making each one separately audible in a piquant simultaneity that at some outside limit actually hurts the ear. Pain is the instrument of this oral pleasure, but it must be the articulated pain, at least two very different kinds of sounds at once. Yet the occasion to say something like this about music does not come very often, and is at best an impoverished pastime. Images, on the other hand, can be thus endlessly collected, provided it is understood that there also color, or provided it is understood that here also color and coloration, even the degrees of black and white, especially the tonality of the monochrome, which offers something like a translation, and therefore something even closer to language, of the range of separate color, are the true object of the quest, and are what is always described over and over again in different words and by way of thoughts that do not look the same. Coloration is, in that sense, materialized subjectivity. So it is that still that we vainly search for across the plates and glossy prints. Not only would an aesthetics of film be indistinguishable from the latter's ontology, it would be social and historical through and through by way of the very mediation of form itself. If you grant the historicity of perception and of the apparatuses in which it is registered and registers all at once. Many of these essays collected here are occasional. One cannot always write about the things one admires. On the other hand, all of the occasions in question begin in the senses, so to speak, and attempt to derive a historical, perhaps first of all a film historical dimension from that initial experience. I may also say that this kind of analysis resembles Freud's mainly in the way in which, when successful, it liquidates the experiences in question and dissolves them without a trace. I find I have no desire to see again a movie about which I have written well. It will be observed that the conception of film presupposed here is one in which the closest relative of the medium remains the novel as such, rather than such more obvious cousins as the theater play or video experimental or commercial. But the differences may be worth stressing, and they become more visible when one thinks of the social role criticism of the novel has so often played in any number of national traditions, and not only in the West. One thinks of the great 19th century Russian essays in which Tsarist censorship is surely not the only motive for the choice of the novel and its problems as a vehicle for social commentary, but one thinks also of Luzon's Brief History of Chinese Fiction, 1923 through 1924, and then from him back to De Sanctis, Brandis, Saint Beuve, and Taine. To be sure, in talking about fictive characters, you can use the same language it might be more dangerous to use about real ones, it remaining for our own contemporaries to reverse the process and to argue or to discover that talking about real characters and historical situations is not much different from talking about fictive ones anyway. Meanwhile, in certain cultures, the existence of a foundational text or the transformation of this or that novel into such a text, the systematic conferral on it of a kind of scriptural status opens up the possibility of a different kind of intervention for the commentary form. As witness the innumerable Spanish meditations on the Quixote or Norenga's allegorical use of Genji, not to speak of the diagnostic value of books like Jules de Gaultier's Le Bon Versim. Significantly, such commentaries have been notably absent from the Anglo-American tradition, with the signal exception of D.H. Lawrence's Studies in Classic American Literature, which bears on a different culture from his own and is thus, like so much of this writer's work, a kind of metaphysical travelogue, Elsewhere, however, from René Girard's Mensonniche romantique et vérité romanesque to Carantini Kogen's Origins of Modern Japanese Literature, the genre of the, quote, theory of the novel, end quote, has been capable of a resonance that far transcends mere cultural critique. The fundamental work in the paradigm, Lucat's theory of the novel, posits the realization or determinate failures of achieved novelistic form as the surest symptom of the possibilities of individual and collective life in the capitalistic or in the capitalist period. While it is no accident that the most recent or belated, perhaps even posthumous, work in this genre, Franco Moretti's Way of the World, rehearses and interrogates for one last time those classics of political philosophy and sociology which have been all but excluded from the positivism of their own specific disciplines, and rewrites Lucas in the secular tones that benefit a postmodern age, taking the formal compromises of the Bildungsroman as indices of the specificity of a daily life unique to middle-class existence. It is to be doubted whether any study of film can have this philosophical or historical value. Lucat's standpoint turns on the structural possibilities of the novel to solve its, quote, form problem, end quote, that it can never really do so. Of course, another matter closely related to the structure of capitalism. The significance of that, quote, form problem, end quote, then lies in the fact that it is a place in which aesthetics can be seen as another form of ethics, or even for a Lucas that follows immediately on this one, another form of politics. In film, however, it is my sense that none of the innumerable formal problems solved in the process of composing a film add up to the august metaphysical volume of the Lucasian form problem itself. In film, the visual glues of all these things the visual glues all these things back together in another way and seals up the crevices in the form. It introduces a third thing alongside the classical Aristotelian question of plot and the modern Benjaminian question of experience. Quote, irony, end quote, as a grand philosophical issue does not take on film, even the romantic kind, nor is it likely, despite Deleuze's pioneering attempt in his books on cinema and on Francis Bacon, that the meditation on the visual will achieve even the symbolic value of the 19th century meditation on music. But there are certainly other ways in which film has marked the life and work of writers in the 20th century, and it is always worth remembering the degree to which going to the movies has been a very basic part of the weekly and even the daily life of modern intellectuals. Sartre, a moviegoer since the age of 3, tells us somewhere that the theory of contingency, the fundamental experience of nausea, and the cornerstone of Sartrean existentialism as such was derived from the experience of film and, in particular, from the mystery of the difference between the image and the world outside. Should that biographical fact not play a philosophical role in the rereading of this thinker? It is conceivable that a properly cinematographic experience may thus similarly lie buried and unspoken, if not unconscious, in the text of any number of other respectable, which is to say, non-movie-going poets and essayists? Did human nature change on or about December 28, 1895? Or was some cinematographic dimension of human reality always there somewhere in prehistoric life, waiting to find its actualization in certain high technical civilization? And thereby now allowing us to reread and rewrite past now filmically and as the philosophy of the visual? My long concluding reflection scarcely tries to answer or even ask these questions, but it does offer the most sustained rehearsal of the dialectic of realism, modernism, and postmodernism that I have so far attempted, and which I have hitherto misrepresented by staging one or the other in isolation. This dialectic seems to me to provide at least one formal mediation capable of including history within the sensory experience of the screen. There are obviously any number of others, as was indicated above, but it does so only on condition of remaining dialectical. Indeed, the laws and accounts registered for each moment clearly remain absolutely asymmetrical and of distinct and different types. Modernism turning out to be anything but an inverted realism, and postmodernism anything but a cancellation of modernism. Two antithetical remarks occur to me in conclusion. The first is that all this has very little or nothing to do with television, which makes me wonder whether the entire discussion is not in the nature of a post-mortem on a now historical form or medium, which finds its philosophy as well as its history posthumously. The second is that film itself has never been more alive than it is globally, where in the New World system a host of local voices have found the most sophisticated technical expression. A filmmaker in whom I have been interested was described in some local journal or other as, quote, the Antonioni of Taiwan, end quote, at a moment when we in the West, for all kinds of socio-economic reasons, no longer have our own Antonionis anymore, or our own Hitchcocks or Fords or Godards. It is good to know that elsewhere outside the first world, we can look forward to their reinvention along with the culturally unforeseeable itself that had seemed to be a casualty of the end of modernism. Durham, December 1989. And I was reading the introduction to Signatures of the Visible by Fredric Jameson.